Krishna was an enlightened being, a yogi of the highest order, a divine personality like several others who played an extremely important role in the story of Mahabharata. The Mahabharata, which is attributed to Vyasa, originally wrote a very short version of the incident. It was originally called Jaya with only 8,800 verses attributed to Vyasa, then updated to Bharata with 24,000 verses as recited by Vaisampayana, who was a student of Vyasa, and finally the Mahabharata as recited by Ugraseva Soti with over 1 lakh verses. The story did originate after a great battle, maybe from a single source named Vyasa, or by multiple poets that got attributed to Vyasa at some point down the line. And the story was retold again and again by the charioteer bards who were professional storytellers of the time and who added their own appreciation for different characters in the epic with adjectives and exaggerations that made the whole epic look unbelievable and finally made it look like just an imaginative story rather than actual history. Another really interesting point that adds to the historicity of Mahabharata is this. Drishtadyumna was the son of King Drupada of the Panchala kingdom mentioned in the Mahabharata, who was given the commandership of the Pandava army according to the available historical and archaeological evidences that we have. The Kuru kingdom was a Vedic Indo-Aryan tribal union in northern Iron Age India encompassing the modern-day states of Delhi, Haryana, Punjab and some parts of western Uttar Pradesh, which appeared in the Middle Vedic period, that is 1200 BC to 900 BC, and developed into the first recorded state-level society in the Indian subcontinent. The historical kings Parikshit and Janmejaya are featured significantly as scions of the Kuru clan. Drishtadyumna was the son of King Drupada of the Panchala kingdom mentioned in the Mahabharata, who was given the commandership of the Pandava army during the Mahabharata war. His claim to supreme commandership is also strongly supported by the composition of the Pandava army. The Pandava army had 7 Akshohinis or divisions. Each commander commanded his own country's army. This conclusion is interesting because it leads to a very astonishing point that nearly half of the Pandava army was made up of divisions from Panchala. This is a huge deal, and it would not be unreasonable for a kingdom that contributed so disproportionately to the Pandava army to also have supreme commandership over it. At first glance, it seems rather surprising that of the several hundreds of allies that the Pandavas gathered in the war, the Panchala army would contribute such a large percentage of military might. One explanation would be that while other allied kingdoms a fraction of their total standing armies to the war, the Panchalas went all in. Almost 100% of their army participated in the war. Why did the Panchalas have such a huge stake in the war? We already know that Drishtadyumna was Draupadi's brother and therefore brother-in-law to the Pandavas. This fact too has deeper consequences that meets the eye. For instance, it is generally known that Draupadi had 5 children by the Pandavas, 1 by each. We also know that when the Pandavas went on their 13-year Vanvasa to the forest, they did not take any of the children with them. So where were the kids? Arjuna's son Abhimanyu, we know, went and stayed with Krishna, as did his mother Subhadra, and Draupadi's children stayed with Drishtadyumna. So these 5 children were in essence brought up in the Panchala court. There are huge implications to this. The eldest, Yudhishthira's son, Prativindhya, was the heir to the Pandavas. So in essence, the heir of the Pandavas was brought up by the Panchalas, and it is fair to say that had he become king, the Panchalas would have had a very influential position in his reign. The Panchalas and the Kuru kingdoms are next to each other, like India and Pakistan. The Kuru and Panchala kingdoms shared an intense rivalry with the overall geopolitics of the Mahabharata India. They were originally one kingdom, ruled over by Puru and his sons, and over the years split into 2. While the Kurus were stronger at the time of the war, the 2 kingdoms were engaged in a constant to and fro rivalry for power and influence in the northern part of India, and through various alliances had a say in the politics of the entire subcontinent. According to the story, about 20 years prior to the Mahabharata war, a major shift happened in the balance of power between two kingdoms, and that was triggered by the annexation of northern Panchala by the Kuru army under Drona's instigation. This annexation is generally assumed to have been some kind of renegade action by Drona and his disciples headed by Arjuna to avenge his insult by Drupada during their childhood according to the story. However, this is hard to believe by any stretch of imagination. First of all, Panchala was a full-fledged kingdom with a full-fledged army. Second, there is no way that the first war in which the Kuru princes participated could have been fought without the full endorsement of Bhishma and the Kuru court. We must treat this battle of annexation, therefore, as a precursor to the Mahabharata war, where Bhishma, sensing an opportunity to change the balance of power, sent a force under Drona's command but with full force of the Kuru army behind it to take over northern Panchala. Further evidence that this was a Bhishma-sanctioned action comes from the fact that while Drupada was forced to hand over half his kingdom to Drona, Drona never becomes a king or even a chieftain. How is it that he continues to be a mere acharya in the Kuru kingdom even after winning an entire kingdom? The only explanation is that the northern Panchala was in fact annexed to the Kuru kingdom. Perhaps Drona and Ashwatthama assumed some kind of titular command over it, but that was very much under the sovereign command of Bhishma. These facts paint the Mahabharata in an altogether different light, in contrast to what's explained in the story that we hear today. What if the war was not in fact a war between cousins, but between two kingdoms, the Kurus and the Panchalas, with the Panchalas pushing for a favorable regime change in the form of the Pandavas? This radical idea explains one more fact that has been puzzling students of the Mahabharata for time immemorial. Why would Bhishma, Drona, and the other luminaries of the Kuru court join the adharmic or evil or the unjust Kauravas against the dharmic or just Pandavas? The answer is because the battle is not between Kauravas and Pandavas. The battle was between two kingdoms, and for Bhishma and Drona to join the Pandavas was in reality equivalent to them joining the Panchalas. They were not fighting on the side of adharma. They were merely fighting on the side of their own kingdom against an ancient and powerful enemy. Furthermore, Bhishma was killed by Shikhandi and Drona's head cut off by Drishtadyumna. Both were instances of victories of Panchala warriors over Kuru warriors with only supporting roles by the Pandavas and the intellect of Krishna. When we look at the war as being one between two kingdoms, we also find it easier to explain why the entire subcontinent is drawn into the war. Why would all the kingdoms of the subcontinent range themselves on one side or the other side over a family feud? What could possibly motivate the massive economic destruction that the war was bound to create, regardless of who won on the kingdoms that were far away and remote from Kurukshetra? The answer is that they were all invested one way or the other into the balance of power between the two great powers of the era, the Kurus and the Panchalas. Just as when World War II broke out, every country had to take a side. When the Mahabharata war broke out, every kingdom had something to gain or lose in the outcome. So the bottom line is, the Kurus and the Panchalas were large powerful kingdoms in a constantly shifting balance of power. This balance of power was completely shattered by the annexation of northern Panchala by the Kurus. As a response to this, the Panchalas carefully cultivated an alliance with the breakaway faction of the Kuru lineage, the Pandavas. This alliance was cemented by a combination of matrimonial ties, economic ties with Indraprastha, logistical support during the Pandavas' exile, and military training of the Pandavas' heirs. At the opportune moment, the Panchalas challenged the Kurus to a war with the intention of achieving regime change and regaining lost territory, with the Pandavas of course being the new regime that would be established if the war was won. Bhishma the patriarch and Drishtadyumna the crown prince were the respective commanders of the two sides. Drishtadyumna and his brother were responsible for killing two successive commanders of the Kaurava army. The war was more or less won after Drona's death. At the cusp of victory, a guerrilla attack killed Shikhandi, Drishtadyumna and the other Panchala leaders. and Yudhishthira and Pandavas gained power, uniting the two adjacent kingdoms into what would over the next centuries become the largest, most influential kingdom in India. And as always, the history of the war was written by the victors. Thus, the Mahabharata was a truly pan-continental, epoch-changing war. It was not a family feud. It was not a battle simply for dharma, though we can see why the later poets must have cast it thus. Now, that does not mean that Duryodhana was actually just an innocent man or the Pandavas were just as evil as an average militant. Remember, these stories exaggerate the characteristics of the people but possibly keep the roots true. We could assume that both of them were flawed like anyone else, but Duryodhana leaning more towards corruption, cruelty, lust, greed, and violence, and the Pandavas trying to find a way out of it. That being the reason they were supported by Krishna himself. The aim of Lord Krishna was to bring spirituality and yoga into the daily lives of the people. Another fantastical element that describes the Pandavas as being sons or devas or gods could also be explained. Like the Pandavas, many ancient Egyptians and other rulers were attributed to be descendants of gods, especially in the Egyptian culture, where the pharaoh was considered next to a god born out of divine blessings. Finally, the Ramayana and Mahabharata are indeed history. How much of it is true and how much of it is exaggeration? There is no doubt that there is a lot of exaggeration that happened over a period of time. As of now, Parikshit and Janmejaya too are considered as actual historical figures. Parikshit being the son of Abhimanyu and Abhimanyu being the son of Arjuna himself according to the Mahabharata text. All the places mentioned in the Mahabharata are accurate according to history. It's indeed a little hard to segregate these exaggerations and convert this poetic excellence to real historical version. But above all of this, the question is, how does it affect or influence our lives today? Regardless of it being history or a myth, the important thing is what we learn out of the priceless knowledge that is given to us, because these tales are timeless and will always be relevant in the world. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate you supporting and sharing this video. See you next time.